Thank you very much for your attendance this evening, for this conference devoted to the themes of the borders and hospitality. But it must be said it's another conference on migrations. It's fairly frequent at the moment. In the news requires it. And a non-negligible part of my professional job concerns this kind of discussion. And we know that at MSF as well, that notion of welcome are a part of the daily work of our operations. We can see that during the point forward, concerning the missions in France, in Libya, or in the rescue missions at sea. And yet, when I read the two works which are going to underpin this evening by Benjamin Boudou, The Dilemma of Borders and the Politics of Hospitality, Aspects of Hospitality, we find it very interesting, and then after that we want to share his work and Benjamin's thoughts with you. His approach seemed original to us and constitutes a good stimulation to be able to tackle these two topics. And so I'm going to introduce our invitee. Benjamin Boudou is a political scientist, and he works at the Max Planck Institute, and he is also the author of the Political Reasons. The Politics of Hospitality is drawn from his doctoral thesis, and he published it in 2018, and his second book on the borders. And so we would like to invite you to participate today, and I hope we're going to be able to discuss his interest in us for our organization and the operations, which we very seldom tackle in this field. That is, we want to delve into the political theory and to combine the approaches which are anthropological, historical, and political scientists, and to examine the concepts of borders and hospitality, and to understand their genealogy, where they come from, and how we can use this vocabulary in a more constructive and a logical way, and a political way even. And so the politics of hospitality, Benjamin establishes a typology between 5 kinds of hospitality, where he tries to decipher or demystify, rather, the political stakes of this hospitality, and to describe the ambivalence of the term hospitality, the dangers that go along with it. And he calls on the use of a concept of hospitality, which is fairly original, and it doesn't rely just on ethics in the situations he will talk about later. When he examines the dilemma of borders, he examines the registers, the legitimization of the borders to be able to build the contemporary debates on immigration, and his thoughts are going to end with the working out of his own conception, democratic conception of borders. I'd also like to mention an article that he wrote on AOC talking about the legitimacy of the borders, when he challenges the legitimacy of borders and also the democratic qualities. And so he is going to talk about this evening, and so will we. And we want to continue the discussion in the second part of the evening, and following his intellectual way. And we also want to examine the effects on reality and the contemporary situation, which are of greatest interest to us. So without further delay, I want to give the floor to Benjamin, whom I thank very much for coming, because, as you know, we often will invite people whose work we appreciate. And other times we invite people that we don't know less, but whose thinking has stimulated us when we read that, and that's the case this evening. And so thank you very much again to Benjamin. Have a good conference, and later we will have a question and answers. And about 7:30, we will invite you also to have a drink out in the hallway. And so thank you very much, Michaël, for this invitation and the crash. Your welcome is very agreeable when I'm a young researcher and to discuss and present my work, which is, but also to compare them with other ideas and to try to draw something from this kind of event in this conference and to discuss and to learn from you, those who work in the field, because I'm going to try to defend the political theory to demonstrate the interest of it in any case. But of course, there is a possible myth or a danger of abstraction, and why we need this kind of thinking. And in any case, it's very important for me to be able to compare this theory with the approach which we have when we talk about theory. We are going to be talking about theory, but there are certain nodes of truth in all that. And when we put them in a context, I'm going to try to demonstrate exactly and convince you that this approach is valid and rich, but mostly very much ignored by the public, even in the scientific circles. To give you a little bit of background where I come from, when I began working on this thesis on hospitality, the basic difficulty I had, nobody really believed in this topic because it's kind of a strange topic. And it's and so to work in political science in France, sometimes it's difficult to be able to present this topic. And what I wanted to do was to legitimize it because it's seeing it as an important topic. And there are a lot of people, the concept has become a public concept by now. There are a lot of articles in the press and in journals and reviews on this topic. And for me, this national reality says something that what is going on is that we have to go look for an older concept, which in the beginning was rather contested to face a new problem, and also the issues of trying to understand why concentrate on this word, why focus on this word. So that was the idea that's in this book. I'm going to try and show you the reasoning the thinking that I developed in the second book about what I've said about hospitality, and that I am now at present even more critical about this concept now, and also the importance of it. And so, but the issue that I want to talk about, even if the theory is political, we are talking about it's not an empirical problem. It's not that the borders are. It's not a way to manage the flows. That's not new, but politicized in a rather unusual, original way. And it leads to conflict. So the person who says the older to be able to control flows, it means justification. As soon as you have a control and you stop people from entering a country or you constrain them, you have to have a justification. You have to explain why. The democratic principle, the liberal principles, philosophical liberal policies, that all authority has to be justified. And so there have to be good reasons. And so we know that this control of the borders produces suffering and deaths even, and constraint, and legal domination, even once people get across the border. The good reasons that we're going to give to be able to control the borders have to be more and more radical to justify a stronger and stronger justification, because the results of controlling the border are much more dramatic. There is kind of a swing movement which is becoming stronger, and we have to oppose it stronger and stronger with all the arguments we have, intellectual and political, and in the field, and in theory, to provide the good reasons to be able to control things differently. And so my work is to try to say that we have to deconstruct and reconstruct and assess all these standards and these arguments and all these so-called good reasons and these values, and in whose name we control the borders, to try to assess them, to try to find out what are the best ways to justify, the best arguments, those of which are consistent, those of which are not consistent, and that's where where philosophy has to come into it as well. The final stake is to think in the end, when we have to make something thinkable, that there might be another way of looking at the policies of immigration. And so the first objective of the book is that we need philosophy and political theory, because the migratory issues don't just deal with facts. It's just not a battle of facts or figures. Recently, there was a call by a certain number of researchers to constitute the situation equivalent to the discussions on climate. And so we have to bring up the facts that the sociologists use that to the ears of the politicians and citizens, because the argument is, the foundation of the problem is that we are ignoring the reality of immigration or migration. Except the problem, I think the people are very reluctant to be receptive. It's not because they're on the left or the right. It's difficult to be able to talk about a justification of our own values from arguments. And so we work on that. To work on this, that we have to use anecdotes, we have to use emotions, and so we have not only established facts, but we also have to establish trust in the facts, and we have to work on what we would call the supervision of the facts, the metaphors, which we also call amalgam sometimes. Because it's very difficult to escape from that. The most classical, traditional example, major American authors to say, if I tell you not to think about an elephant, the first thing you're going to think of, obviously, is an elephant. And so the associations we make, for example, the word border and migration, whatever we say, it produces preconceived ideas already. Liberty has more to do with terrorism rather than the family, unemployment rather than students. All this means that the facts, it's all well and good to establish the facts, the framework is established, and what we put through the metaphors and the narrative, we have to create something that has to be studied. Putnam, the American philosopher, says that always the experience and the effects always come from shouting the values. And it's on that which I am working. And we have to investigate as well on the conceptual constructions. And so what is a political community, for example? What do we mean by that? What purpose does it serve? Materially speaking, but also conceptually concerning borders. Who are the migrants? Should we consider that normal, or should we see it as exceptional? But there is an effective judgment in this choice. Is it more in our interest to preserve culture, religion, homogeneity in society of a nation, or the interests of individuals? And what do we mean by culture? What do we mean by the individual interests? The concept and the definitions, the criteria on the topic, we have to weigh this up in the balance to be able to talk about the effects. And so we need to establish the facts, but what the social science is doing, we need law as well on migratory issues, and because they require laws, but we also have to work on the moral institutions as well, and I work a lot on that. What do we feel which is fair or not? We all have a sense of justice. With immigration or migration, the public opinion is sensitive to a photograph of a child, a young child, dead on a beach, and we say that is unjust, unfair. And so it shows the sense of justice. But that has to be worked out further. That has to be elaborated. to see what we consider as fair or just. And so this is at the heart of what I'm doing. We can ask the question, for example, imagine you're a doctor working in a hospital and somebody presents and has been stabbed. The decision to care for this person comes from what? Did you ask why you were stabbed and who stabbed you? Or is our first thought to somebody is wounded, you have to do something to help him or her? And I imagine we have a tendency to say the role of the doctor is rather more, say, to care for the person, however it happened. What if we transfer this moral intuition here to the issue of immigration? The legal category of refugees, we distinguish between a more generic of the migrations. It begs the questions, because why do we try to establish this theory? The need of triggering responsibilities. The responsibilities of somebody as soon as somebody expresses a fundamental need to be cared for example. Now, in that case, the way that we are going to generally classify refugees according to legal criteria, that is the cause for their demanding asylum, that is the law and a certain number of facts we've seen come with the values, and the rights come with the category, and the moral intuition, even if it's true in legal terms, they are criticizable, and we could challenge these criteria. We can also challenge the scope as well, but we'd even think about the reason of this category. It could be criticizable as well. The difficulty with the concepts, the criteria, values, are basically, they are controversial. We agree, for example, generally speaking, on values, but not on details. And so we agree generally of the importance of liberty, equality, fraternity, and hospitality. But as soon as we go into details, the polemics really start. The controversy and the fundamental disagreements start at the beginning. If we talk about liberty at school, for example, and equality in companies, or fraternity with migrants in specific contexts, there the concepts are really controversial. And that's the very nature of the political concept. The idea of controlling borders is highly political, but it's also very controversial. We could agree with the fact that borders are a source of protection, protection of rights, protection of democratic institutions. But according to the criteria we're going to choose to define if the border is legitimate or not, or if the control is legitimate or not, we could then determine something as rather arbitrary. And so controlling borders enters into contradiction, in particular, with the moral legality of the person and with the liberty of movement. And to manage to hold together a good justification of keeping the borders and this fundamental belief in liberty and equality, and that is the dilemma of borders. That's what I call the dilemma of borders. If we talk about the reasons, we close the borders, protection, security, the building a political community where equality and liberty does reign. Between the reasons that we close the borders and the consequences of this closing, the denial of the liberty of chance, of possibilities, also emergencies, security, in short, between the reasons and the consequences, that creates a tension as well between them. What is clear is to force liberty of migrants and to try to control these flows acts on citizens. You cannot close the borders and control foreigners without controlling citizens as well. And so constrain the liberty of movement by migrants and breaking equality of people in the name of a strict distinction between citizen and a stranger, a foreigner, saying that the democratic norms limiting to to the national territory. That is to constrain the liberty and to break up the movements. We have to ask this dilemma. We have to challenge this dilemma, but that is the spread between the principles, the values, and the norms and the practices, between the ideals and institutions. And this spread between what we want, what we do, and what we think we want to do, and what we do, that is the topic of what I'm studying. To be able to apply a judgment. And so what are the answers to this dilemma? And that is the purpose mainly of the second book that I've written, On Borders. How can we reduce the spread between ideals and practicality? And to speak very schematically, the first is to have to give the best reasons possible to close borders. To date, they are insufficient as justifications. And so I have studied various different things, whether we have to control borders or not. We interrogate the community, the nation, the republic. Without going into detail, I tried to say that in the end, these aspects of it, closing borders, relies on postulates of a vision of the world which are contradictory. This is certain, I call that reasoning. And so we have a postulate and we draw certain consequences from it. We can discuss as much as we want on the consequences, but when you start with a postulate, there you have a problem. I'll give you three postulates. The first reasoning is what I call the reasoning of interiority. This goes through all Western thinking, passes through all Western thinking. When we try to think about what is a good society, how can we imagine its institutions, we begin by saying, let's imagine a closed society, for example. We start with that. You have the citizens, they read all the theories about the social contract, and so there are a group of citizens or people, and we have to imagine the good institutions. Is it going to be a democracy or a monarchy? And secondly, afterwards, and moreover, we can have relationships with foreigners and foreign communities and foreign sovereigns as well. And so that supposes that a closed political community is the first, and then after that comes the possible relationship with the outside. But it's obviously not how that happens in reality. And so this first postulate leads to certain judgments and consequences which I think are wrong, are faulty. And the second is, I'm sorry, I missed it. And so this is the subject. When we talk about discussion, we have to try to see what we have to really see. It gives a priority to those who are already on site. That is, with this idea, the citizens have the right, because they are citizens, to determine who can belong among them. And so this is the reasoning of the distribution of belonging. In the same way, we distribute it in the same way that we organize our institutions, and also self-determination, etc. And also the criteria of belonging. This is the second postulate. But the problem with that is that who has given this right, first of all, to these citizens, and who determined who were the first ones, the people who belong, to be able to then decide afterwards. For me, it appears as a privilege, because we opened up the debate. The Canadian author says that it's a feudal privilege, and it's transmitted down the family line. And this reasoning is very problematic. The third postulate is that of consent. Here I'm trying to show, especially in the Republican arguments that we have an idea of what we call the common good. The common good is that in the world where we are able to define our concepts, and which comes with a whole set of values, well defined, and for the issue for somebody who arrives in new control is to consent to these values. I've written a chapter on the contract of integration, and the imagination of the social contract, because it's the reasoning of the contract, the idea of a contract that is with these people. If this interests you, you sign it, and if you don't want it, don't sign it and go away. And so it's a faulty reasoning, because the values are well defined, as I say, because the very principles in politics are that they're fundamentally controversial and challenged, but it is polemical, it's conflictual. And we talk about the principle, those who arrive have nothing to say about these values. They have to simply accept them. When we go a little bit further into this, in this literature of the social contract, it's not how that happens. It's precisely the idea of signing a social contract is the idea of working out together the values and the principles by which we're going to live. And from the moment you say that we've already defined the values, all you have to do is sign them. And that just reinforces the exteriority of the foreigners, which is faulty about these arguments. The reasoning, nationalist reasoning, the Republican reasoning, and the community reasoning in the American sense of the word, that is the determination of a closed community, relies on faulty reasoning. And you have more subtle arguments, a whole set of them, and this idea of better justifying the border controls. It's very interesting, but it's something that isn't very well known. You have to justify forming borders on individual rights. For example, the right of association or the right of property. These citizens have a right of associating, and when you have a right to associate, that means you don't have to associate with certain people. So we have the right to refuse people to enter into our society. And so they try to draw a philosophy by saying that we have a right to refuse the entry of new members, or the reasoning of property that I am a property and citizens own their own territory, for example. In theory, again, it's more subtle than that. But basically, it's that. And when we are landowners, we can decide who's going to enter or not. And all these arguments, I try to criticize them and, first of all, take them seriously, without just brushing them aside, but I want to take them seriously, to detail them and explain them and also deconstruct them. And so some of these arguments are not very convincing, but it's very difficult to go from individual reasoning to collective reasoning, that individual rights and rights of property. Do citizens, are they really ownership of their own territory? And moreover, does property is defined as an exclusivity? And you have no duty to open your door to try and assist somebody in danger. And so the idea of property is never exclusive, and it can include also certain responsibilities.
So that's for the first background of arguments, which said, let's find better reasons to fill the gap between reasoning and practices, good reasons to close the borders. No, we might also say the opposite camp, the opposite side might say, we need to reassert strongly the principle of liberty, fraternity, equality, and hospitality, and we have to review our practices to be more consistent, because we can no longer walk like this and talk differently. We have to assess the effect of our values, and I'll give you 3 examples. The first one is that of hospitality, and as I said, it is an issue I've been studying for many years. In my first book, I've tried to convince about the political nature of this concept, demonstrating that throughout history and in anthropology, this concept of hospitality was always present to address a particular problem, which is the following: how can we interact with foreigners so that this interaction will not lead to integration? Hospitality through rights and practices are ways to interact without guaranteeing any integration of the foreigner. It's also a disguise on power relations, disguising them as a religion, as a morale. So that's why this concept is present in many across cultures and religion, because it's always meet the same need, and that's my thesis, which is that it's always political, but it has always been disguised with the costume of religion, of culture, etc. And I'd like to say 2 words about it, because this hospitality idea is being revised again in my second book. Because what do we do today when we talk about hospitality? What are we trying to say when we say that it is on behalf of hospitality we have to open the borders? And of course, I'm interested in this because this use is controversial. Even Marine Le Pen claimed that she could show some hospitality. Ironically enough, she said, I'm a person who's extremely ready to be showing hospitality, but we decide who we want to welcome. So hospitality might also imply a nationalistic type of statement. We find this in Charles Maurras with Alain Finkielkraut, a French philosopher, that before welcoming, we have to be what we are. France is not a brownfield. You have to show that you have some identity before showing hospitality. Marine Le Pen says that hospitality assumes the power of the one who is welcoming. So it means that it is based on non-equality relations. My thesis is that because this is an anachronical concept, the history of hospitality goes back to Homer's, the Greek, the Romans, the Middle Age, hospitality in Kant. It's throughout history, and it's because it's ambiguous, it's old, it's anachronical. It may be the focus of many criticism. Sometimes we make alliances in the political field with people. We do not always agree on all items, but generally speaking, we agree with them. And hospitality is a way to do that. You hide behind the carpet things that you don't want to talk. Humanitarian has a connotation. Hospitality is general, ambiguous. It's a concept that has been here for a long time. Therefore, it may gather some critics to express something that doesn't fit. Hospitality always goes along with inhospitality. And more recently, I've tried to define it more precisely, and I've looked into practices. This book, namely by Pôle d'études recherche urbaine, une urban research study cluster, and they've worked on observing the different types of hospitality initiatives. And I've tried to say that hospitality, and I've tried to be as accurate as possible in defining it. When it comes to speeches and statement, it's criticizing the administrative, political, and legal failures regarding migration and asylum seekers. And there's this duty of hospitality, which is what I would call, and I will explain it, it's a non-perfect cooperative duty. It is not a duty that implies a right. It's a duty, it's not perfect, because you cannot oppose it, and it is collective. It's just to relieve the plight and the misery of those who are trying to cross the borders. And this is what I think is one of the most accurate definitions of what hospitality is today. So that's the first family of argument. The second family of argument is liberty. The third one will be equality. Freedom, liberty states or implies that freedom of movement is necessary because it is good for what it is, and it is an excellent way to fulfill our rights. Freedom of circulation is the supreme freedom. This is what Hannah Arendt said, the right of leading to access to other rights. And moral intuition is very simple. It says we've opened borders between countries, within a country. Even a single country, it was not possible to cross borders, and there is no reason to limit this opening of these borders to this nation state. The reasoning was to lift all obstacles within a country, and the same reasoning should apply internationally. If I want to work in another county or in another department in my country, why shouldn't be allowed to cross a border and have the right to cross a border very easily in another country to fulfill our personal or political objectives, for family, having a family, friends, etc., for political debates. To fulfill and meet these interests, you need a rather broad surface so that you can move around and fulfill these rights. And for this very reason, freedom of movement is necessary. Freedom of speech, when it does exist, but you're not allowed to leave your house. Freedom of speech is limited if you have the freedom of association, but you cannot associate more than 2 people. It's no longer exist. So freedom of movement allows for that. Third thing, and that's my proposal at the end of the book, which is equality. This theory of hospitality is too ambiguous. This theory of liberty has its own specific problems. So we need to find a reasoning which is not so utopic and something more practical. And this idea is fairly simple. But once again, I think it can be fulfilled in an interesting way. The idea is the following. And democracy is based on a key idea, a strong idea, which is anyone who is impacted by a decision, by a power, should have the right to say something about it, to speak out. If somebody makes a decision that does have an impact on you, you may consult, you may vote on this proposal. Those who are the lawmakers should also be in line with the objects of power. They are the subjects of power and the objects of power that should interact. And we always talk about the Athenian democracy between quotes, because indeed Athens was a democratic state with its citizens, but women, slaves, children, foreigners didn't have a say in this. We have to obey laws that we were not involved with. Now, if you agree with me on this democratic principle, then one has to recognize, as I said in my introduction, that the power of borders and controlling borders does have an impact first and foremost on migrants, much more than on citizens. And if we want to be consistent and democratic, and if we recognize the value of this principle, the principle of affected interest, my interests are affected, and I'm entitled to representation and to be involved. Therefore, the power of borders assumes that we also take into account the interests of migrants. It also implies a possible democratic inclusion, so the right to vote for foreign residents, it's an essential value of the democracy, because as you reside, you live in the country, you have a family, you work, you at least have the right to vote. But more than that, we might say it's not only those who reside in the country. Once I've opened the debate, and we know that power is also the source of suffering and death. Therefore, those who are affected should also be included and involved. And the whole challenge today, and that's my third challenge is what should be the institution behind all this. And in my book, I've talked about the parliament of migrants, that is having some representation. Representation that is something that is dear to us because all our democracies are based on representativity. I believe a lot in representation, even though it's pretty much criticized. And we may represent different ways to represent the interest of foreigners. We know we do that for climate change because the phenomenon of climate change is something that is by nature a cross-border phenomenon. Therefore, you need representatives of nature. In the Parliament of Things of Bruno Latour, you have this idea of an international representation that the nation states are no longer able to address these issues. So that's a general principle. It is on because of equality that we can judge about the legitimacy of borders. We might not reject all of them. It's not because they are historically arbitrary that are unfair. They could be legitimate. They could be a source of protection. But when there is an infringement, that there is a breach of the fundamental rights of people, that borders may be challenged. I'm not talking about with or without borders, but when a border, which is always a source of power, becomes a source of domination, because challenging the dignity of people, the fact that they are being ignored, that their rights, their basic rights are ignored, with all the social discrimination resulting from borders, these are all good reasons to mobilize philosophy, conceptual word, to better define these values and these interests, and to find the interests to sharpen our criticism on this situation. Thank you, Benjamin. These are arguments that are extremely convincing from a theory standpoint. Of course, we're not going to talk about put this in practice because it would be a major pitfall, but I would guess that most of the debate will be about this. That is, how in our daily operational practices or in our daily practice of politics as citizens in France, in Europe and worldwide, how can we make use of these tools? I'll give the floor to people who would like to talk. My name is Nathalie. Good afternoon. I wanted to pick up on what you've just said and ask the following question. Are we asking ourselves this question as citizens in absolute terms? Or do we ask ourselves this question, what MSF could do or should do? What is the scale of this concern? Because as a citizen, we might have a lot to say, but why is MSF opening this debate? And what does that mean within our organization? It will be difficult for Benjamin to answer this question. I'll try and answer this question myself. I don't know whether Corinne is in the room or somebody might take up. To me, the interest was to try and understand what is behind words in this concept of hospitality, a concept of hospitality that I use a lot, not every day, but I've written some articles opposing the cynicism of European states and hospitality I was calling for, and the controversy, the ambivalence of this concept, as we've just heard, helps us to position ourselves and to draft a different political discourse. When it comes to borders, not only at MSF France, but at MSF, at least since 2015, and since we've started and opening up new missions with migrant population here in Europe, And we've been looking into this concept of borders, what is our positioning on freedom of movement, under which conditions movement should be allowed, freedom of movement for whom. And these are complex ideas, and we've done a kind of twist which is publicly acceptable, but it's not so clear about that. We've talked about safe passage, so that borders could be crossed without causing any harm to individuals. But it doesn't answer the basic question, which is the one which was asked to us, which was, what do you want as an organization? So Benjamin doesn't tell us what we want, and even though we might have an opinion about it, but it is a source of reflection, helping us to get out of this pitfall of closed and open borders. I've read Régis Debré's book entitled Pour la frontière, for the border. It's only 75 pages. I've done terrible things. I've read Régis Debré, says Michael. And Régis Debré says the border is a wall protecting us against chaos. That border is not like a wall. A wall prevents passage. A border may allow for passage, but it's a protection against chaos, and it also helps define where we're from, as this concept of community was explained by Benjamin earlier. So it has helped me to think about it, and it helps individuals caught in these debates to try and better understand its controversies. It doesn't necessarily result in recommendation or a prescription of a political positioning of the organization, but it's an additional brick in our thinking process. That's all I can say about that. Isabelle Sansa, I'm a member of the GISTI information group to support migrants in France. One observation to you, Michael, and also to you, Benjamin. You were talking about the way MSF had twisted around this issue of opening of borders, focusing on safe passage. In our organization in 1997, we've also had to deal with that because it was raising too many debates and questionings, the opening of borders. And we've talked about the need for freedom of movement. It was an open letter to the Prime Minister at that time, Lionel Jospin, and we've really focused on freedom of movement. So we kind of bypassed this question of borders. A question to you, Benjamin. You have looked into the reasons why borders were being closed in a long article, which is Charles Ler, Lorenzo Benzani, and Maurice Stern. So I'd like to know what is your opinion about it, or maybe you don't have any opinion about it, on the various concepts that may exist on the other side, that is, those who are in favor of opening of borders with the opening of borders and some practical experiments. The opening of borders, the abolishing of borders, the banning of borders, and the autonomy of migration. And they've shown it over the last 20 years, and they've given their own conception, which is an autonomy of migration, and having institutions also present, but mainly local institutions, that is, municipalities. And lastly, and then we'll be good enough with what I have to tell, For the very beginning, this concept of borders of the European Union is completely disconnected from this concept of physical borders. The borders of Europe are in the south of Europe. They are in Niger, they are in Mali, and our friends Charles Heller and Cristina Del Biagio, geographers, who said that for them, a border doesn't have any physical connotation. It is a political and social construction of the mind. Thank you for these observations, for these comments. Let's try and take it from another viewpoint. In my methodology chapter, I don't talk about the physical definition of borders for the same reasons, because for sociological reason, a border is first and foremost a social fact, which is then translated in a given space. And borders, as they are being used and practiced, are not the object of our decision. So I agree with you. And there's something else I wanted to add, but it kind of is flipping away, but that's okay. For the first comment, I'm trying indeed to study seriously those who are in favor of closing the borders, to deconstruct their arguments, because it's also the object of a whole literature in political theory, where there are some very reasonable people who use principles we might agree on, democracy, and says that it means a drastic control of borders. So I'd have to find ways to criticize them, to start a dialogue with them. And secondly, try to come up with this proposal for this freedom of movement, for this unconditional duty of hospitality. What I don't do is look into the literature on economics about this, because economists have also talked a lot about borders and freedom of movement. And I try to justify the freedom of movement by talking about an inclusion of migrants, which is different from the generalized freedom of movement. And therefore, the comment about what you were making, it is precisely because I try to think out of this state-nation concept and what was called the methodological nationalism, considering the state-nation as the beginning and the end of any political work. And municipalities and networks of cities are emerging as being the best operator practicing this hospitality, as we've seen in the sheltered towns in the United States after the election of Trump. I'm very interested in the dialectics between those big towns, these cities who are becoming more legitimate on the international scene and say, we are opposing federal administration. We are already powerful cities. And they can justify it because the majority of migration will be towards urban areas. People want to settle in towns for all very good reasons. So they can certainly gain in terms of legitimacy on the international scene. And that's also, say, Toronto, Chicago, San Francisco, say, we are cosmopolitan, open cities. Therefore, we will be welcoming people. It's almost civil disobedience. While in Europe, we are more focusing on refugees sharing best practices. And Germany, the country where I work, is a very interesting country for that. So in Europe, we think of migration also from towns and networks of towns and cities. It seemed to me the simplest way to do that, much more than the state-nation concept.
So I want to give a very quick reaction to what we've just said on two things. You've obviously talked about democracy and to broaden the democratic community to migrants themselves. In terms of this, when you mention an international parliament, there's there's also the real democracy of every day. We have people who we have elected, and they haven't been elected for another program than that which they had promised during their campaigns on this issue of migration. And that is true for the three previous French presidents, for example. There is indeed a democratic accountability. It's there every day. As you mentioned in your book, it may be unsatisfactory, but it exists. And if we push the logic a little bit further, the reasoning a little bit further, an immigrant parliament may lead to an additional thing in the democratic community, and we have a very difficult time seeing how the present democratic community could support that. The third point, reacting to the idea of refuge, it seems to me that we know all of the dynamics that we are confronted by, and also the city decisions don't always come from a democratic will, but administrative decisions of elected officials who decide for other people in the name of their town. And we're going to see afterwards what's going to happen with the participation of citizens in decision-making. Doesn't seem to me to have been systematic or properly looked into, perhaps. You can even go further in the criticism to criticize me by when the reasoning of the interests are affected by decisions taken by those in power. If we think about that for 5 minutes, but we are all affected by Trump's election, for example. Does that mean that we should have a right of vote in American elections? And why not? Some people have even supported that. We said all the decisions that can potentially affect everybody, and from that moment you have to start thinking about the demos, general people, and organize a global rotation for it. In theory, that works very well, but you can imagine how complicated it is in reality. But the definition of a community is also possible. And that's why I try to think we might think differently, out of the box a little bit, and to channel the principles in 2 ways, saying that, yes, everybody can be affected. We're all affected by Trump, but we're not all affected in the same way. We haven't got the same interests. There are the fundamental interests and the fundamental needs. Others have different interests, are more negligible. And we get into a democratic discussion. What is a basic interest? Is it a matter of survival, or is it an interest for the citizens? We can think about that by saying that we can make a separation between that. The second thing is to say that we may not be able to arrive at having the right to vote, and then we come to your final point. But a right representation enables us to maintain what we know as the democratic community today, but integrating other things, which would be this pathway of those who cannot vote, and of the migrants. We're thinking about this for the future generations. I mean, they're not going to be able to vote because they're not present, but there has to be at least somebody, a representative, that says that I will speak in the name of future generations. When you make a decision, because this is going to affect future generations, there has to be somebody to give voice to it and to agree or not agree with what's being proposed. Now, on the migratory issue, for example, the model of the rights defenders, I'm not interested so much in democratic decisions because, as we know for a long time, democracies, if we reduce it to the power of the majority, the democracy always has an illiberal potential. And so with this reasoning of representation, it says that we have to maintain the voice of those people who may be crushed, even if it's democratically done, and this legitimized by the vote. It's not legitimate because we're in the process of crushing the right. If we talk in the name of the minorities, and to be able to the fundamental rights that they may prevail. You can elect a majority and have a majority of citizens for suppressing these rights. But the idea of representing, according to the interests, enables us to avoid this general deflating in a way to accommodate so that to see that the public opinion is either pro closing the borders or something which might be more practical. And this reasoning of representation, but the issue of representativity in the relation between the person who represents and is represented, it functions slightly different with the right of voting, which is more complicated because indeed this requires reviewing the way in which we define the construction of the democracy. Those who say, for example, the advocates of this cause, and so we are speaking in the name of a cause. No one has elected it. We're going to defend a cause. There's obviously responsibility. To whom are you accountable when you argue like this? So you can see that it's fairly complicated. When an organization like MSF, that's a question which I'm sure you ask yourselves. But to be an advocate of a cause in a parliament, for example, it's not necessarily democratic inside and not necessarily elected by the people who participate, but it participates in the democratic process for those who participated in a way that we can think about the new modalities of representation, which are less than traditional. We can see, as you said earlier, that the facts are not really highly considered in the political debate. The facts are not given much consideration. The issue of political theories are not often talked about in the daily discussions or in partisan discussions, no more than with us. Because we have other objectives, other purposes of aid. But to come back to the debate or discussion on the political level, how do you see the building of an audible narrative which can be heard around these questions, these issues? To get away from the literature side, but also to be able to feed the political debate, so that we don't remain, as we mentioned earlier, just a discussion dealing mainly with perceptions more than on facts or on theory. It's a hard question to answer because this begs the question for me of a more general question of the role of the researcher and the role of his responsibility and his usefulness. And it's difficult to answer because we have to be accountable to two types of people. We have to be accountable to our profession. The goal of a researcher is all the more so is to be able to be published someplace and to be listened to, and we have to show that we are worthy of attention. And so, writing in an academic world, that is, I mean, we do have to rely sometimes on jargon. We have to talk about the language of the people who hold the keys and the power within the academic community. I've kind of got a double agenda. I have a scientific one because I have to address a community of researchers, and a certain number of things which are part of an issue which enter into this field. But what interests me, with an issue like this, it also affects the political narrative. If I have a duty in relation to my profession, is to say that I have to be more coherent, consistent, more systematic, scientific, with a lot of quotes around them, obviously, because it's not science in the proper sense of the term, but the various criteria that have to be assessed. And to a certain degree, we have to remain neutral. We have to be able to be neutral. Nonetheless, by choosing a topic like this is already taking one side or the other. And so there's a second narrative that has to be done to say that my purpose is to produce knowledge which is going to be mobilizable. And so I kind of prefer the second one on my own, which I have to produce a scientific narrative, but also produce a narrative which is operationable. And so I see this, I take this from a very personal point of view, even as a researcher, but when I tried to dole out the task, when I said in the beginning, my purpose is to try to produce arguments that can be used, and in the longer run, more or less the medium to long run, how they can be applied. I have a difficult time doing more about being an absolute militant in life, which is another kind of activity which I could deal in. But my objective is not to make a seismic change in what I'm doing, but to produce knowledge which is as serious as possible and taken to the very limits of what I'm able to do, then to make these arguments as material as possible, substantive as possible, which is saying a lot already. And both the questions we have to ask ourselves is that we have to be able to navigate between a scientific narrative, but I also wanted to emerge from the academic world. I've been exchanging arguments in a symposium, for example, or here in a conference like this, but here is a way to be useful and to do politics, between quotes, accessible and possible, to make everything as possible, a narrative which does have certain requirements. So it's a kind of an ambiguous answer I'm giving you here, but it seems to me the most sociologically credible answer that I can give. And because there are professional constraints, we are tenured sometimes professors as well, so it has its requirements. And so I have to respond to the profession for the statutory reasons, and this poses very material requirements in scientific terms, because it's a topic which, to this degree, is so much in the news, where there's so much social demand to understand what is going on. And when we write a book, it's also a way to understand what we think. It's not to pontificate, but I really want to discover what I'm thinking about things, and I do that by putting it on the page. But we need facts, because we don't know them, and we may not want to hear them, but we have to have criteria to be able to judge these facts. And that's where the political theory and sociology comes into it, and field work, and that's where these come together on these three levels. And that's the challenge I'm facing. It's scientific, but it's also existential. That's a way that I experience my profession on a topic which is eminently political. So thank you for your answer, and also your sincerity, your frankness about it. Now, are there any questions from the room? Raphael, I work with MSF in the field. My question has to do with the rights. Can we consider that basic rights, since they are applicable to everybody, can they also protect the categories of citizens within the country where people are trying to migrants are trying to get into? Yes, I think so. I think there's basic rights, or the basic interest relies on a definition of fundamental rights. It's essential because they have a purpose of being applied in the same reasoning of human rights. And so in terms of humans as opposed to citizens. And this can be applicable to more than just one particular community, which makes the context more interesting for me, and at the same time is really a hot topic. But there is a legitimacy of these basic rights, of the cosmopolitics and the human rights in the broader sense of the term. And so we believe in these values, even if it's a belief which is very difficult to establish, because this goes back to the tradition of natural law. which is difficult to justify right to the end, because natural rights rely on a theological vision of man. But fundamentally, we do believe in these basic rights, and the international law and the distribution of these norms through various courts, national and international, who dialogue between. There's a system there's a circuit system which then drifts down from international to national levels. And at the same time, on the other hand, there are public opinions which are rather hostile because we feel that the citizenship and the labor market are difficult enough to get into because to keep out other competitors like migrants. So the cosmopolitics are translated by the fundamental rights, and but the starting point of a theory of the freedom of movement or theory of fairness of migration. This raises certain problems of justification. For example, can we manage right to the end of justify human rights? And in the old dilemma of human rights, where we see that these rights, we enjoy them as humans, but they are not, but you can only do through the political community. We have to be protected by somebody. We always come back to that issue. And so these rights don't systematically protect us. And so we return to this dilemma between universalism and particularity, me as an individual, and the fact that we have to be present in political committees to be able to defend these rights. So somebody has to defend these points of view in the name of particular values of a political community. But beyond these difficulties, these conceptual difficulties, which are very strong, the consensus that abides on these fundamental rights is the best base to justify, the best foundation to be able to justify cosmopolitanism in a moral sense and a legal sense, and therefore political. Gabriel, a student, medical student, so I'm going to talk about human sciences. I'd like you to a clarification about what you said earlier about Marine Le Pen's narrative, or what Finkelkraut thinks about before what we have to do before welcoming anybody, and as a result, this notion of integration and also the implication that may have that there's a relation to power and domination toward the people that we welcome, that is the migrants. And is for you this notion of integration, is there a relation of domination in relation to the people that we welcome, or not necessarily? How do you see it? What I mentioned before, I use the issue less the concept of integration rather than identity, meaning that it's a real strong point in philosophy and all the traditions. So I'm not sure how to put this exactly. But first of all, there is a closed identity among the political community. Also, this has to do with individuals. But basically, I am myself, and I am an ego, and I encounter an alter ego. And this gives rise to a certain number of arguments. Fundamentally, before this encounter, this interaction with somebody else, there is an identity. We have to begin by identifying this strong identity to be able to launch a relationship. But there's also another philosophical tradition which says it's not how it happens in reality. The hostility is not closed in on itself, and eventually with a relationship with other people, but it has to be built through a relationship with another person that we understand ourselves. The major documents on hospitality with Paul Ricoeur rely on this idea that it's through social interaction, through the experience of other people, we understand our own identity. Ricoeur used a psychoanalytical metaphor. From the moment that we recognize the consciousness of another person, that we can access to our own identity. When you displace this specific case on a political level, it has an importance. These various reasonings that are poisoning our reasoning. From the moment when we talk about the political community already in interaction with foreigners and already in a building of borders, obviously it's not going to be established on its own, but we have to revise our ways of reasoning on these issues. Therefore, we have to plan. We can keep these identities, this concept of identity, on the condition of defining in a more realistic way. It's a choice, but define this concept of identity through other people and not in opposition. So I quoted Marine Le Pen and Finkielkraut, because in the second part of your question, this implies a relationship with power, because it functions in this order. First of all, oneself, and then come the others afterwards. And this supposes a preeminence, a privilege of oneself over another person, or, as I explained in the book on hospitality, and in a ritualized inversion. The ritual of hospitality in traditional societies depend on when a foreigner arrives, they give everything to that person. They give you as the best table, the best gift, for a certain fixed time. And so the foreigner is magnified, is almost made a divinity, to give value to the values of the community itself. And so to give the foreigner a privileged position, in reality, we're reconfirming that it's the community which, in fact, dominates the situation and is able to give this privileged position to the foreigner. In the same way, we say that there's a macho narrative which says, for example, my wife at home and she's the one who runs the house and things like that. And obviously, she runs the house, all the more so that she doesn't run anything else outside of the house. And it's in that circuit that she does the decision-making, but what that does is diminish her political value. So we have this reasoning and the view of hospitality. It's a privilege which we accord to some and not to others. Like Marine Le Pen will choose the people that she's going to deal with, obviously, and for example, for a particular time, and the major opponents, this brilliant idea of affirm that it's in the name of the respect to the other people and foreigners and diversity that I'm going to close the borders. Everybody should stay in their own place, and it's magnificent in other words, but I don't mind an experience of people outside of my country, but as long as they stay in their own. And that can carry the day in face of the general indifference. As far as a person is far away from the country, that's just fine. But as soon as they come into our country, then that's when they have to be dominated. And a thesis which I try to defend, it's a relation of power, it's a relationship of equality, and it's an urgent issue. But it's not for all that all the concept has to be rejected, but it does raise all these problems. And so it carries an ideal with it of identity. And that's why it has to be handled with very, very carefully. Newton, I'm a student in cultural affairs. I'd like to know about the concept of hospitality. Given that you are in a process of demonstrating that it's a matter of a concept that goes beyond the subjective level and private level, individual level, I'd like to know when we associate that with the French model of integration, do you think it could be a tool for improving or changing in a positive way this model of welcome and integration? Is hospitality a corrective or something that can be added to the model of French integration? We would have to talk along that, because when we talk about the French model of integration, which is a very complicated thing, because it relies fundamentally on the idea that integration is among political activists. It's something we have to do. We have to integrate ourselves. We have to find the means to integrate these people. What I think, for the Max Planck, I agree with what she said. Integration should always be a side effect. So we always integrate through something, through active politics, and if we try and do that directly through active politics, it always falls by the way, because we have to try and define to what we are trying to integrate into. And so we have a lot of great narratives about what the republic is, what democracy is. We may agree with it or not. But the idea of the minister, it relies on these major Republican fantasies, which raise a lot of problems. And I think integration functions more as a side effect. That is working when we have participated in organizations or life. What we're interested in is this blend of things, and that's how we learn about other mores of other people. And what is done, the specifics of it, and that's how we transmit information. And so in that hospitality, and this is where we come back to integration, it functions on an anthropological level on the model of the passers. When we have something, we have informers, for example, and we're going to explain to you how things work, etc., and how the relationships with powers are carried out. Today, and so it relies on people. I can help you to fill out this questionnaire, for example, this form, and I'll explain how it works here in this country. It's on that level, and that's how. So this is one of the ways of the actors in hospitality is to be able to provide the certain codes to be able to integrate people into society, to give people hints how to better integrate. And so I have major theories about what should be integration, apart from this very simple, from this. It's in this direction that, in fact, I would go. Now, Le Tison, student in risk engineering at the University of Paris. Now, in the public space, we hear a lot about the migratory crisis and the crisis of the refugees. I'd like to know about the dilemma on the borders. Could be considered as a crisis in relation to human rights, especially when you spoke about the normalization of the norm. Are they taken into account by public powers? Considering the second question about the migratory crisis, the very idea itself, in a sense, was useful to be able to warn us about something, but it also raises a lot of problems. So it's not a migratory crisis, but it's more a crisis of welcome. The dilemma on borders corresponds to this crisis? In a sense, yes, because the crisis is a symptom of the border dilemma, that the fundamental spread between values and practices say that, one, we don't agree on the values, and the practices are not up to our values. And so there are a whole series of principles to be able to criticize these practices. And so these dilemmas produce symptoms, political symptoms, and in that we can bring these back to this issue of crisis. And the issue about normalization of norms is another issue. It's difficult to go into. What does that mean? It's not just a border which kills people, but politics which accept that as a possible consequence. This is the old narrative about saying you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. And that is an unfortunate proverb which does explain a lot of the mentality of many people. It's not just that it not only creates death, but also the politics arrive and how it can be justified according to practices. And the deaths have to be put in a context, so we're starting to work a lot on that. What does it mean to die at sea? Or what kind of tomb can we give to people who die in the sea, bodies who don't belong here or there? It opens up a whole can of worms concerning the work in relation to migration. And I don't work directly on that, but what strikes me most fundamentally, and this is how I started my studies, how can we have a still legitimate power when it produces death? And I begin the book like that. It's a political question, but it's also a moral question. Fundamentally, what I say in relation to, from the moment when you have a feeling of unfairness, that something isn't working, that means that we have a sense of justice, fairness, and also we have criteria, which may not be perfectly formulated, but we have to be able to deploy them, these moral questions, to be able to see how far that'll take us. And when we go right to the end, if we're going to remain consistent, we could say that this meaning comes from someplace, that is, it comes from a belief in democracy and also in fundamental rights, and therefore we have to change practices.
Andrea Soler, I've studied political sciences and I'm pretty much interested in migration, and I currently work with the Red Cross. And I wanted to know, you talked a lot about the nation state, and this crisis of asylum is constantly in the news. And even though we've talked about the nation state and European integration, a nation state is rooted in our mentalities and in the actual facts. And what you seem to suggest as an avenue to be looked into as a way to represent migrants, would you consider it as a national scale, so in France, or at a European scale? And do you think that were it to be possible at the European level, don't you think that it would be more efficient? What is your viewpoint about the tension between the nation state and supranational institutions regarding the respect of fundamental rights, which have been discussed earlier as a concept to be used, and in practice, this is a problem that NGOs such as MSF have to deal with. So this tension between the interests of a nation state when controlling the borders and while trying to respect fundamental rights, which are theoretically related to supranational institutions, because we've talked about the cities as a possible avenue for thought, but what about the other players? Your two questions, in essence, deal with this question of which level or which scale are we talking about. The nation state is both too small and too big. It's too small in view of the migration phenomena and too big for tangible actions. That's why we have this scale of cities now. What you were talking about the nation state, which is enrooted in our mentalities. Bourdieu said that the way we think the state and all these implied categories that we have in our daily lives, and it's also implied in all scientific work, and this requires a lot of thorough work to show that we have to think in terms of at the scale of a transnational environment. Once you've said that, you have to identify at which scale you should be working. Should we work right from the beginning, work at the international level, like the United Nations, or the regional level, like the European Union? I'll be very modest about it. I'm not involved in institutional design, so these are questions to be raised in practice to try and see what is the most efficient level. The same question was asked about global compact. What type of multilateralism relationship do we want to set up. It raises governance, who decides, who implements what is written on paper, and these are extremely difficult questions. They're difficult in practice, but they're also difficult to deal with and to address in theory. What I'm interested in for the moment is the urban level, the urban scale, because cities have attempted to be more autonomous in relation to nation states through the quote-unquote management of migration, to try and win this power. The way the European Union works when we talk about freedom of movement is maybe a possibility. Of course, this freedom of movement, which is also limited at the European level, and I don't think I will carry on because you would be talking for hours and say blunders. So I'll stop here. This kind of work has to be done by other people, and I can't manage to do that. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll conclude very briefly and say that Benjamin has raised this question in an article in the name of what do we leave people drown at sea. No, there is the moral concern that we all have, but it also could be raising legal questions. It's not normal to let people drown at sea. It also raises a political question. Why do we leave people drown at sea? What are the geopolitical and territorial dynamics in the background? Today's debate, the mobilization of political philosophy, seem to me bringing an additional argument to try and understand these dynamics and these processes. And I would like to thank Benjamin for having been with us. Thank you very much.